Even my servants speak 3 languages. Knowledge alone does not make someone remarkable. 42 people had laughed at her 2 nights ago. Her own husband had led them. She had said nothing then. She had lowered her eyes and kept eating, and let them believe she was exactly what they decided she was. But the letter she had just written in French, in Italian, in the precise legal language of 3 countries, had already left Fairfield Manor at dawn. And when it arrived, nothing about James Fairfield's world would be the same. She had not needed his permission. She had never needed his permission. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better, this story is for you. Subscribe and tell us what city you're joining us from tonight. The carriage rolled through iron gates just after dusk, and the gravel beneath the wheels sounded like applause nobody meant to give. Rebecca Caldwell. Rebecca Fairfield now. Though the name still sat uneasy on her tongue, pressed one gloved hand flat against the velvet seat, and breathed slowly through her nose. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the road from London. She had told herself she was ready. She was not ready. Fairfield Manor rose out of the October dark like a cathedral built by people who wanted God to feel inferior. Every window blazed. Every column stood at rigid attention. Footmen in powdered wigs lined the entrance steps, and behind the tall front windows she could already see the silhouettes of guests moving, turning angling toward the glass to catch their first glimpse of the woman James Fairfield had brought home. Rebecca had heard the whispers before the carriage had even cleared London. She had caught them in drawing rooms and coaching inns, in the careful pauses between sentences, when people thought she was too far away or too distracted to hear. Scholar's daughter. No family name worth mentioning. Pretty enough, they say, but that won't carry her far at Fairfield. She straightened the ribbon at her collar and did not let her hands shake. James descended from the carriage ahead of her. Of course he did, because James Fairfield moved through every room as though the room had been built specifically to receive him. He was not cruel in the way novels described cruel men. He did not sneer. He did not shout. He simply existed at a frequency that made everyone around him feel slightly less substantial, and he had never once seemed to notice the effect. He turned back and offered his hand to help her down. "Chin up," he said quietly, and she wasn't certain whether it was encouragement or instruction. She took his hand. She kept her chin up. She walked through the front doors of Fairfield Manor without flinching, and if the assembled household staff looked at her with anything other than welcome in their eyes, she decided immediately that she would not let herself see it. The dining hall that evening was everything she had feared, and everything she had imagined, and somehow still worse than both. 42 people sat around a table built for power. Crystal caught the candlelight and threw it in every direction. Silver gleamed. The women wore gowns that cost more than her father had earned in 5 years of teaching, and the men wore the particular expression of people who have inherited enough wealth that the concept of effort has become quaint to them. Rebecca sat at James's right hand, which was an honor that meant she was close enough for every person at the table to study her without appearing to do so. Lady Eugenia Hartwell sat across from her. Lady Hartwell was 60 years old, built like a portrait that had learned to move, and she had the eyes of a woman who had survived 4 decades of London society by knowing exactly which questions drew blood and which drew nothing at all. She chose her questions carefully. Lady Fairfield. The title landed with a kind of weight that made it sound like a test rather than a courtesy. I understand your father was a great scholar. He was. Rebecca lifted her wine glass without hurrying. He published 3 volumes on trade linguistics before I was 12. How remarkable. Lady Hartwell's voice contained precisely the same warmth a winter window contains. And you spent your childhood among books then, rather than society. Among books and languages, yes. Rebecca set her glass down carefully. My father believed that understanding how people speak to one another was the beginning of understanding how they think. The table had gone somewhat quiet. Not completely. There was still the clink of silver and the low murmur of side conversations, but the quiet that matters had settled over the guests nearest to her, and she felt it the way you feel a drop in temperature before a storm. Lord Ashmore, 2 seats down, smiled into his wine. Your wife speaks several languages, does she not, Fairfield? A pleasant voice, conversational. But his eyes moved to James with the specific interest of a man watching to see how the cards fall. James did not look at Rebecca. He lifted his own glass, turned it once in his fingers, and said, "Of course she does." A small pause. Just long enough. "Though even my servants speak 3 languages in this house." The corner of his mouth moved in something that might have been amusement. Knowledge alone does not make someone remarkable. The laughter that followed was polished and precise, the kind produced by people who have laughed at the right moments for so long, it has become reflexive. Lady Hartwell's smile sharpened. Lord Ashmore looked satisfied. The women nearest to Rebecca murmured to one another behind raised fans, and their eyes moved over her with the careful assessment of people deciding what category to file her under. Rebecca felt the words land. Felt each one find its particular place inside her chest. She did not argue. She did not correct him. She did not look up from her plate. She cut a small piece of pheasant and brought it to her mouth and chewed it slowly, and the only person at the table who might have noticed that her jaw was set a fraction tighter than usual was not looking at her at all. James Fairfield was not a bad man. Rebecca had understood this before she married him, and she still understood it now, and the understanding did not comfort her in the way she wished it would. How is a man built by certainty? 3 generations of Fairfield men had stood at the center of English commerce and society, and 3 generations of being right about nearly everything had produced in James a particular kind of confidence that sat so deep in him it no longer felt like confidence at all. It felt like truth. He believed genuinely without malice that he was seeing the world clearly. And because he believed it, he corrected things. He corrected her French pronunciation at breakfast. Not unkindly, just matter-of-factly, the way a man corrects a clock that runs slightly slow. He corrected her opinions in company, not by contradicting them, but by smoothing them, softening them, redirecting them toward safer ground. What my wife means to say. A phrase she had heard 6 times in 2 weeks of marriage. He corrected her choices in small things. The hour she woke the books she kept on the sitting room table where guests might see them. The subjects she introduced in conversation, and which ones were better left to the gentleman. He was never angry about it. That was the thing she could not explain to anyone, the thing she lay awake at night trying to find language for. If he had been angry, she could have pointed to the anger. She could have named it. Instead, he was patient and steady, and entirely convinced that he was doing her a kindness. He wanted to shape her into someone who would fit. He did not understand, could not seem to understand that she already fit something. Only that something was not the shape of his world. She began her real work in the 2nd week. It started because she was bored, and because boredom in a woman with Rebecca's particular mind had always been more dangerous than grief. The estate's correspondence room was on the east side of the house, 2 doors past the library, and it was a room where nobody seemed to spend much time beyond leaving papers and coming back later to be frustrated by them. She found it by following the sound of James's secretary, Mr. Gibbs, muttering under his breath in a way that suggested he was arguing with documents and losing. She stood in the doorway. Gibbs looked up with the expression of a man who had been caught doing something undignified and was now calculating rapidly whether to be embarrassed or relieved. Lady Fairfield. He rose, knocking a stack of papers sideways. "I apologize, I didn't hear you. What language is that?" She nodded toward the document spread open on the desk. Gibbs hesitated. "Italian, my lady. From a merchant house in Venice. Lord Fairfield has been attempting to—" He paused with the delicacy of a man choosing between honesty and diplomacy. "The translation services in London have been somewhat delayed. May I—" Another hesitation. Then he stepped aside. She crossed the room and leaned over the desk and read for perhaps 2 minutes. The letter was from a trading house called Marchetti and Sons, and it was written in the particular formal Italian of Venetian commerce, dense with embedded conditions and subordinate clauses that most translators would have flattened into something more manageable and in flattening made meaningless. She read it again. She looked up. "This is a preliminary agreement, not an inquiry. They're operating under the assumption that Lord Fairfield has already agreed to the primary terms." She pointed to the 3rd paragraph. "This clause here, it reads as a courtesy, but it isn't. It establishes Marchetti and Sons as the primary creditor in the event of any dispute over shipment valuation. It would give them the right to seize cargo before arbitration. Gibbs stared at her. "I beg your pardon, my lady. The translation services in London," she said carefully. "Have they been given the full document?" "Only the first 2 pages, my lady. The rest was considered supplementary." She straightened up. "The rest is where the teeth are." She walked back to the door and then paused because something in her wanted to leave it there to simply pass the information and withdraw. But the thing inside her that was her father's daughter, the thing that had grown up surrounded by men who respected precision, could not quite do it. "Tell Lord Fairfield," she said without turning around, "that he should delay his response until a full translation is completed. I would suggest not using the London firm. Their Italian is serviceable, but they have no training in commercial contract language." She went back to her sitting room and picked up her book and sat with it open in her lap for a long time, without reading a single word. James did not mention it at dinner. He did not mention it the following morning at breakfast, though she watched him and knew from the particular stillness of his expression, a stillness she was beginning to learn the way you learn a landscape, that something was working through him. It was Lord Oliver Kingsley who brought it up 2 days later. Kingsley was James's oldest friend, in the particular way that men who have known each other since childhood are friends, with a mixture of loyalty and understanding and the specific freedom to say things that no one else would dare. He arrived on a Tuesday morning on horseback, windswept and cheerful, and settled himself into the Manor's east sitting room with the ease of a man in his own house. Rebecca was passing the door when she heard her name. She did not stop walking, but she slowed, simply astonishing James. "Gibbs showed me the letter. She'd caught something your London solicitors entirely missed." "Yes." James's voice was measured, controlled. "So she did. You don't sound especially pleased about it." "I'm pleased the error was caught, and not pleased about how it was caught." A pause. She could hear Kingsley's amusement, warm and without cruelty, the amusement of someone who genuinely likes the people he teases. "She's sharper than you bargained for. I knew she was educated." "Education and sharp are different things, old friend. Plenty of educated people are perfectly harmless." A brief silence. Rebecca, on the other hand, appears to have read the room somewhat better than anyone around her. James said nothing. "You corrected her French at breakfast last Wednesday. I was there. Her French is better than mine. The pronunciation in certain—" "James." Kingsley's voice was still gentle, but something in it had settled. "I've known you since we were 7 years old. I've watched you be wrong about 3 things in all that time, and I've watched you work harder to avoid admitting it each time than you worked to fix whatever went wrong. Don't let this become the 4th. A long silence. Then, "She embarrassed me." Not angry, not defensive, just the fact of it stated plainly in the way James stated most things. "In front of the household staff," he continued, "correcting estate business without consulting me. She corrected a document. She told Gibbs, not you. She didn't announce it at dinner. She didn't have to announce it. The entire correspondence room knew by James. Gentler still. Ask yourself something. If one of your solicitors had caught the same error and flagged it to Gibbs, would you be having this conversation with me?" The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. Rebecca moved away from the door. She wrote letters in the evenings when James was in his study and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. She wrote to her father, who was in Edinburgh studying something she couldn't keep track of, and to her old tutor, Madame Lefebvre, in Paris, and to a network of scholars and correspondents she had built since she was 14 years old, and had understood that her mind needed more room than any single household could provide. Her father wrote back promptly. He always did. His letter, which arrived on a gray Thursday morning, began in the usual way. Questions about her health observations, about Scottish weather. A running argument with a colleague about medieval shipping routes that had apparently entered its 3rd month without resolution. Then near the end, "I had occasion recently to think of the Fairfield family. You may not know this, your James certainly would not, but his grandfather came to your grandfather in 1789 with a significant problem involving Dutch traders and a disputed shipment. Your grandfather spent 6 weeks working through the documentation. He saved the Fairfield estate a considerable sum. James's father sent a note afterward. Brief, polite. No acknowledgement of the debt in any lasting way, of course. I thought it would be useful for you to know this. Not for any purpose of wielding it, you know better than that. Simply so you understand what history you are walking into. Rebecca folded the letter. She held it in her hands for a moment. Then she went to her writing desk. The crisis arrived in the 3rd month of her marriage, and it arrived in the way real crises always did not, with trumpet fanfare, but with quiet footsteps and a closed door, and the sound of raised voices too controlled to carry clearly through the walls. She heard it at 6 in the morning. James and Gibbs in the correspondence room, and beneath the controlled surface of their exchange. Something that sounded, if she pressed her ear and paid attention, like panic. She knocked. A pause. Then James's voice, "Come." She opened the door. The desk was covered. Documents spread in every direction, papers she recognized from various languages and others she didn't immediately place. James stood behind the desk with his sleeves rolled and his cravat loosened, which she had never seen before and which told her more than his expression did. Gibbs stood to one side with the look of a man who had been awake for too long with too little to show for it. "Rebecca." James's voice was steady, deliberately so. "I apologize for waking you." "You didn't wake me." She came fully into the room. "What's happened?" He looked at the desk, then at her. Then, with the particular reluctance of a man who has spent his life being self-sufficient and is finding it costs him more than he budgeted for. "The Marchetti Agreement. There are additional documents from a second firm, Salvatore Brothers, out of Genoa. It appears the two firms are in partnership, and the terms of that partnership affect the primary agreement in ways that—" He stopped. "In ways that your London solicitors didn't flag. They haven't seen these documents yet." She crossed to the desk. He did not move aside, not immediately, and then he did, and she was aware in the movement of something that had cost him something, though she couldn't name the currency. She read. For perhaps 20 minutes, she read moving papers carefully, following threads from document to document, the way her father had taught her. Follow the subordinate clauses. "Rebecca, the main sentence tells you what a man wants you to think. The clauses tell you what he's protecting, and the picture that assembled itself was clear, and it was bad. This partnership," she said quietly, not looking up. "Marchetti and Salvatore. They're not working together on this transaction. They're working against you on this transaction while appearing to work together." James said nothing. "Marchetti handles the primary agreement, the one with the cargo seizure clause we found earlier. Salvatore handles what looks like a separate insurance arrangement, but the insurance terms reference the Marchetti agreement's dispute clause, which means if Salvatore declares the shipment at risk, which they can do under their own terms with very little justification, the Marchetti cargo seizure clause activates automatically." She looked up. "They've built a mechanism. You could sign both agreements in complete good faith, execute every term on time, and they could still legally remove the cargo and the insurance payout simultaneously." Gibbs made a sound. James was very still. "How long?" he said after a moment. "How long before the signing deadline?" 4 days, Gibbs said. James looked at Rebecca with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She wasn't entirely certain what it was, only that it was not the expression he wore when he was in control of a room. "What would you need?" It took her a moment to understand the question. "A writing desk," she said carefully. "And the names of the principal investors, the English parties, who have committed to the arrangement. There are 6. I'll need to write to each of them." "In what?" "French and Italian both. The agreement is structured across jurisdictions. A unilateral English letter won't carry the same weight." He stared at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Gibbs, bring Lady Fairfield whatever she needs." She wrote for 2 days. 6 letters, each one tailored precisely to the recipient, their position, their stake in the arrangement, and the specific liability they would face if the Marchetti-Salvatore mechanism activated. She wrote in the formal register of Venetian commercial correspondence, the kind that announced through its very structure that the writer understood exactly what they were doing. She cited precedents from 3 separate trade disputes cases her father had documented in his second volume cases she had read and reread until they were as familiar as the back of her hand. She did not tell James she was citing her father's work. She did not tell him that the framework she was using to identify the fraudulent mechanism had been developed by a scholar whose expertise the Fairfield family had once dismissed as quietly and thoroughly as they had dismissed her. She wrote the letters. She gave them to Gibbs. She went back to her sitting room and picked up her book. The first response arrived within 36 hours, then the second, then 3 more in rapid succession. By the time the 4th day arrived, all 6 investors had withdrawn from the Marchetti arrangement, each citing the specific concerns Rebecca's letters had raised. Without English investment, the scheme collapsed entirely. Marchetti and Sons sent a cold formal letter to Fairfield Manor acknowledging that the negotiations were concluded. Gibbs brought it to James. James sat with it for a long time. Then he came to find Rebecca. She was in the East Garden because she had learned in 3 months of marriage that the East Garden was the one place in Fairfield Manor where she could stand still without feeling observed, and she needed more often than she had anticipated to stand still. He came around the corner of the yew hedge and stopped when he saw her. She waited. "The Marchetti matter is resolved." "I know," Gibbs had told her. He came closer. He stood across the gravel path from her and looked at her with that expression she had seen in the correspondence room, the one she hadn't had language for. "The letters you wrote." He paused. "The investors, 2 of them, sent personal replies. Both of them asked who the correspondent was." "What did you tell them?" "I told them the correspondence was handled by my wife." A pause. "Lord Pemberton, you know Pemberton." She didn't. He wrote that the letter was among the finest examples of commercial legal reasoning he had encountered in 30 years of investment. She said nothing. He asked if you had trained in law. "My father trained me in precision." He believed it was the same thing. James looked at the yew hedge for a moment, then back at her. "The precedents you cited, in the letters." He stopped, started again. "I recognized one of them. A trade dispute from 1789, a Dutch shipping matter." She felt something shift inside her. "My grandfather's case," James said. "Fairfield versus the Hartman Consortium. Your father's name appeared in the secondary documentation, as a consultant." The word cost him something. She could hear it. "He spent 6 weeks on that case," she said quietly. "He charged your grandfather's solicitors for perhaps 4 hours of his time. He felt the family was in difficulty, and he didn't want the fee to add to the burden." James was absolutely still. "No one told me." "No, they wouldn't have." "Rebecca." Her name in his mouth said that way, not a correction, not a prelude to instruction, was almost unfamiliar. "Why didn't you tell me when we married? When I—" He stopped. "When you corrected my French." He absorbed that. "Yes. Because," she said, choosing each word with the same precision she had chosen every word in those 6 letters. "I didn't marry you in order to show you what I know. I married you. I believed I married you because I thought we might build something together. And I didn't want the foundation of that to be me proving myself to you. I thought—" She paused. "I thought you would simply see it." The East Garden was very quiet. A bird somewhere in the yew made a small sound and went silent. "I didn't see it," James said. "No." She looked at him levelly. "You didn't." He stood there for a long moment, with the morning around them and the great house at his back, and she watched him do something she had not seen James Fairfield do before, which was hold himself very still and let something difficult just be difficult without correcting it or improving it or redirecting it toward safer ground. "I am sorry." 2 words, precise. No addendum to soften them or reshape them into something more comfortable. She looked at him. The letter from her father was upstairs in her writing case folded under a silk ribbon. The letters she had written were already in the hands of 6 investors across 2 countries. The Fairfield estate was intact for reasons that had nothing to do with the Fairfield family's certainty about the world, and everything to do with a scholar's daughter who had understood since she was 12 years old that the real meaning was always in the subordinate clause. She breathed in the October air. "I know," and she turned back to look at the hedge, and James Fairfield, Duke of Fairfield, master of this house and every certainty in it, stood quietly in her east garden, and for the first time in his life did not know what to say next. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, and Rebecca had always believed honesty was the only ground worth building on. The apology James had offered in the East Garden lasted approximately 4 days. Rebecca counted them not out of bitterness, but because she was a woman who had been trained since childhood to observe patterns, and patterns required data. 4 days of something that felt almost like equilibrium. 4 days of meals where he did not correct her pronunciation or redirect her opinions toward safer ground. 4 days of him looking at her sometimes in that new way, the way that meant something was working through him that he hadn't solved yet. On the 5th day, Lord Ashmore came to dinner. She had not met Ashmore before the night of her arrival at Fairfield Manor, but she had learned him quickly. He was the kind of man who wore his intelligence like a weapon he was proud of, and would happily draw in polite company. He had money and lineage, and the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told that his opinion might be wrong. He and James had known each other for 15 years. Their friendship was built on the specific foundation of two men who agreed about nearly everything because they had both been raised in nearly identical worlds. He arrived at 7, cheerful and carrying a bottle of port that he announced was exceptional, and by 8:30 he was deep into a conversation with James about the London commodity markets that Rebecca followed with half her attention, while the other half of her attention was occupied by the thing she was beginning to understand about her own situation. She had won a battle. She had not won a war. "The Venetian trade routes are finished anyway," Ashmore announced, pouring a second glass of port that Rebecca noted he had not offered her. "The French have complicated everything south of Lyon and east of the Alps. Any man still looking to Venice for commercial arrangements is working with outdated maps." James turned his glass slowly. "The routes through Vienna remain theoretical," Ashmore said flatly. "What moves in practice, James, is what I've been telling you for 2 years. North, the northern routes. Scandinavia, the Baltic ports. That's where real money will be made in the next decade." "The documentation for Baltic arrangements is notoriously difficult," James said. "The legal frameworks differ by port and the translation requirements alone, which is precisely why men with the right resources will dominate it." Ashmore leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man settling into a throne. "Resources being the operative word, capital connections and," he smiled, "the willingness to move before the crowd understands what it's standing in front of." Rebecca, who had been sitting quietly at her end of the table, said, "The Swedish commercial treaties of 1813 changed the documentation requirements significantly. Most brokers in London are still working from pre-treaty frameworks. It's created a 2-year lag in standard practice." The table went quiet in a particular way. Ashmore turned to look at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but something in the space between them. "Is that so? The firms managing Baltic trade most successfully right now are doing so through Copenhagen intermediaries, who understand both the pre- and post-treaty structures simultaneously." She held his gaze. "The documentation burden you're describing is real, but it's solvable. The firms that solve it first will establish relationships that will be nearly impossible to displace." Ashmore looked at James. It was the look itself that told her everything, that reflexive redirect, that instant pivot from her to him, as though she had spoken in a language that required translation into someone more credible before it could be acted upon. "Your wife appears well read," Ashmore said pleasantly. James held his wine glass without moving for a moment. "She is. The Scandinavia question bears looking into." Ashmore continued addressing James as though the previous 30 seconds had not happened. "I know a man at Lloyd's who—" "Lord Ashmore." Her voice was even. Not cold, simply precise. "The source I mentioned, my father's 3rd volume on trade linguistics, includes a full analysis of the 1813 treaty framework and its commercial implications. If you'd like, I can have it sent to your house in London. It would take perhaps 3 hours to read and save you a significant amount of time in conversations with men at Lloyd's, who are likely working from the same outdated framework everyone else is. The silence this time was of a different quality. Ashmore set his port glass down. He really looked at her for possibly the first time since he had arrived, and she could see him calibrating, reassessing, moving through some internal adjustment that his face was not quite sophisticated enough to hide entirely. "That would be," he said carefully, "most kind." He turned back to James. But the conversation for the rest of that evening was quieter. And twice more he looked at her when a topic arose, looked at her, not James, before he caught himself and looked away. It was not a victory. She knew better than to call it a victory. But it was a data point, and she filed it carefully. James came to her sitting room that night. He knocked first, which was also something she was learning to notice about him. The gestures that were small, but not accidental, the movements that cost him more than they appeared to. "May I come in?" She set down her book. Yes. He came in and stood for a moment with that stillness. She was learning the stillness that meant something was working through him that he hadn't found words for yet. In 3 months of marriage, she had learned that James Fairfield was not a man who spoke until he had assembled his thoughts into a shape he could defend. It made conversations with him feel sometimes like waiting for a building to be completed before you were allowed inside. "Ashmore will go home and read your father's book," he said finally. "I imagine he will. He'll tell his colleagues. He'll present the information as something he discovered." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "That's all right." "It isn't all right. It's useful. Which matters more?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You genuinely believe that?" "I believe," she said carefully, "that if the information reaches the right people and prevents bad decisions, it doesn't matter very much whose name is attached to it when it arrives." She paused. "My father published 3 volumes. He was cited in perhaps a dozen papers in his lifetime. The ideas in those volumes shaped commercial law frameworks in 4 countries. He died content." James sat down, which was not something she had expected. He sat across from her in the chair nearest the window and looked at his hands for a moment, and she saw something in his posture that she had not seen before, a kind of tiredness that was not physical. "My father told me once that the most dangerous thing a man could do was allow himself to be managed by someone he had underestimated." She waited. "He meant it as a warning." James looked up. "He meant me to guard against it, to always know more than the people around me, to never be in a position of dependence." "And what do you think now?" A long pause. "I think he was telling me something about himself." He stopped. "I think he was afraid." It was the most vulnerable thing she had ever heard him say, and she understood instinctively that it had cost him a price he had not budgeted for, and that the right response was not to press it. "Ashmore will use the information well," she said instead. "He's cleverer than he appears in company. He's exactly as clever as he appears in company." But there was something almost like warmth at the edge of the words. "It's the rest of him that's more complicated." She picked up her book again, not to read it, but to give him somewhere to look that wasn't her. "Good night, James." He stood. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped. "The Baltic routes. The Copenhagen intermediaries you mentioned." "Yes." "Do you know any of them?" She considered the question. "My father corresponded with a trading firm in Copenhagen for 11 years. The son runs it now. He's 27, ambitious, and extraordinarily good at moving documentation through frameworks that defeat everyone else." A pause. "He wrote to me when my father died. A kind letter. He said my father was the only English scholar who had ever treated him as an equal rather than an exotic curiosity." James absorbed this. "I see." He left. She opened her book and did not read it. The thing about a household is that it has its own intelligence. Not any one person's intelligence, but the aggregate understanding of everyone who worked within it. The invisible network of observation and inference that connected the kitchen to the correspondence room, to the upstairs hallways, and back again. Rebecca had understood this before she arrived at Fairfield Manor, but she had underestimated how thoroughly it would apply to her. The servants knew. Not everything. Not the specifics of the Marchetti letters or the content of what she had read in the documents. But they knew the shape of what had happened, the crisis, the resolution, the changed atmosphere in the correspondence room. The way people who pay attention to the quality of silences always know the shape of things they weren't present for. Mrs. Holt was the housekeeper. She had managed Fairfield Manor for 22 years, through 2 generations of the family, and she had the specific authority of someone whose institutional knowledge was so deep that even James treated her opinions with a respect he gave very few people. She was 61 and built like someone who had been deciding the exact right thing to do in difficult situations for so long it had become her natural posture. She came to Rebecca on a Wednesday morning with a question about linen inventory that Rebecca understood immediately was not actually about linen inventory. Lady Fairfield. She stood in the doorway of the sitting room with a ledger book and an expression of careful neutrality. "I wonder if I might trouble you about the household accounts." "Of course." Rebecca set aside her correspondence. Mrs. Holt came in and sat at Rebecca's invitation, which she accepted with the composure of someone who had learned to accept such invitations without appearing startled by them, and opened the ledger. "The winter supply contracts," she said. "We have 3 firms offering coal delivery arrangements, and Lord Fairfield has historically worked with the oldest of the 3. But their terms this year are—" She paused. "The terms are not what they were." Rebecca leaned over and looked. The terms were extraordinary. The delivery guarantees had been quietly shortened from a firm 30-day commitment to what was now a best efforts clause, and the penalty structure for late delivery had been removed entirely and replaced with language about unforeseen circumstances that was so broad it would have made any litigation essentially impossible. "How long has Fairfield worked with this firm?" Rebecca asked. 31 years, my lady. Lord Fairfield's father established the relationship. And Lord Fairfield hasn't read this year's contract himself." A careful pause. "Lord Fairfield relies on my assessment of household supply matters, my lady." Rebecca looked at the ledger for another moment. "The second firm, tell me about them." Mrs. Holt's expression did not change precisely, but something in it settled in a way that suggested she had hoped for exactly this question. "Established 15 years ago. Smaller operation, but their delivery record for estates in the county is—" She turned 2 pages. "Impeccable, my lady. And their terms this year are a full delivery guarantee with a penalty structure that is straightforward and enforceable. The price difference, 3% higher, for an enforceable guarantee." Rebecca closed the ledger. "Mrs. Holt, what would Lord Fairfield say if you recommended switching suppliers?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Lord Fairfield would ask whether his father's firm had been given the opportunity to amend their terms. And if they amended them, he would stay with them. Loyalty to the relationship." Mrs. Holt's voice was entirely neutral, but the 2 words she emphasized were not. "The relationship," Rebecca repeated. "Yes, my lady." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Leave the ledger with me. I'd like to look at the full 3 years of supply contracts." Mrs. Holt stood, and there was something in how she moved, a straightness, a resolution that hadn't quite been there when she'd walked in. "I'll bring them this afternoon." She was at the door when Rebecca said, "Mrs. Holt, how long have you known the terms of this year's coal contract were a problem?" The housekeeper turned. Her expression for just a moment was utterly unguarded. "Since August, my lady." "Why didn't you raise it with Lord Fairfield?" A pause that contained more history than Rebecca could fully read. "Lord Fairfield," Mrs. Holt said carefully, "receives information about the estate most effectively when it is presented in a particular way. And your way of presenting it wasn't. It was not," Mrs. Holt said, "the way Lord Fairfield expects certain kinds of information to arrive." She left. Rebecca sat with the empty ledger on her lap and understood completely what had just been said to her. She spent 3 days with the supply contracts. It was not simply the coal. The coal was the obvious problem, the one Mrs. Holt had surfaced, because it was immediate and because winter was coming. But underneath the coal contract were 4 others in similar condition arrangements, where the original terms had been quietly eroded over successive years, where language had been softened and protections had been removed in increments small enough that no single year's contract looked dramatically different from the last. Taken individually, each change was a minor negotiating concession. Taken together across 4 years, they constituted a systematic transfer of risk from the suppliers to the Fairfield estate. Someone was doing it deliberately. She couldn't prove that yet, but she could see it. She drafted a summary. Precise, organized, referenced to specific contract language. She presented it to James on a Friday afternoon when Ashmore was not present and the house was quiet, because she had was learning constantly, learning which conditions made information receivable to a man like James, and which conditions made him armor himself against it. She put it on his desk. "The household supply contracts," she said. "The last 4 years." He looked at the document, then at her. She had taken particular care with the presentation this time, not out of strategy, but because she understood now that the way she delivered information mattered almost as much as the information itself, and she was no longer willing to let perfectly good truth be wasted on a delivery that made it easy to dismiss. There's a pattern. Across 5 contracts. The erosion is consistent enough that I believe it's coordinated, but I can't confirm that without looking at the suppliers' relationships with each other. James picked up the document. He read for perhaps 3 minutes thoroughly, she could tell, because James read the way he did everything else with complete attention or not at all. Then he set it down. "I reviewed these contracts in August," he said. "I know. I didn't see this. The changes are small year to year." She kept her voice even. "It's only visible in aggregate." He looked at the papers for a moment longer. Something moved through his expression. Something she was starting to recognize as the particular discomfort of a man whose world is being revised without his permission. "Rebecca." He stopped. "How long did this take you?" 3 days. 3 days, he repeated. I read quickly. He stood up and walked to the window, which she had learned was what he did when he needed to move his body through something his mind was working on. "If these contracts had renewed unchanged this winter," he said, "and we'd had a supply disruption, the estate would have had no legal recourse and significant practical exposure." She paused. "It would have been manageable, but expensive and unnecessary." He turned back from the window. His expression had done the thing she had been watching it learn to do, moved through the discomfort and come out the other side of it into something that was not yet peace, but was closer to honesty. "You did not have to do this." "No. You could have let me find it myself. You might not have found it before winter." He looked at her steadily. "That's not why you did it." She was quiet for a moment. "No, it isn't." "Why then?" It was a real question. She could hear it, the genuine confusion of a man who had been raised to understand help as a transaction and could not quite map what she was doing onto that framework. "Because it's my home. Not a place I was placed, not a position I occupy. My home." She held his gaze. "Everything that threatens Fairfield threatens me. I didn't need you to invite me to protect it." The silence that followed was long enough that she heard the clock in the hall mark the quarter hour. "Kingsley," James said finally. "I'm sorry. Oliver Kingsley told me something the morning after the Marchetti matter was resolved." He paused. "He said I thought education made you dangerous, and he said perhaps it only revealed what I refused to see." He stopped. "I've been thinking about what he meant." "What have you concluded?" Another pause. "That I was afraid of the wrong things." He crossed his arms, which she had learned meant he was holding something in rather than out. "I was afraid that if you knew more than I did in certain areas, it would mean something about—" He stopped again. "About you," she said quietly. "Yes." She stood up. "James, what I know does not diminish what you know. What I can do does not diminish what you can do. The estate is not a fixed amount of competence that gets divided between us." She kept her voice steady. "You built it. Your family built it. I am not here to take it from you. I am here because—" She stopped. Because I chose to be here." The words came out quieter than she'd intended. And because choosing to be here means I choose all of it, not just the parts where I'm decorative and agreeable. He looked at her for a long moment. The supply contracts. What do you recommend? She felt something release in her chest. Small. Quiet. Like a window being opened in a room that had been closed too long. Renegotiate the coal contract immediately. The other 4 can be addressed at renewal, but we should put the suppliers on notice that the terms will be reviewed. And I'd like to look at who manages those supplier relationships on the estate side. Whether Gibbs has been reviewing them annually, or whether they've been rolling over automatically. James nodded slowly. I'll tell Gibbs. I'll speak with Gibbs. She held his gaze. If that's acceptable. Another pause, shorter than it might have been a month ago. Yes. That's acceptable. Kingsley came again in November, and this time he came with his wife. Eleanor Kingsley was 34, dark-haired and possessed of the particular warmth that belongs to people who are genuinely interested in other human beings, rather than simply in what those human beings can offer them. She had been married to Oliver for 9 years, and had clearly long since made peace with his tendency to say true things in inconvenient moments. She and Rebecca liked each other immediately, which happened in the instinctive, wordless way that real compatibility always happens, not through effort, but through recognition. He told me about the Marchetti letters, Eleanor said on the second morning of their visit, when they were walking the East Garden, while the men were somewhere inside, discussing something that based on the volume involved strong opinions about drainage systems. Oliver, I mean. He told me what you did. He told you the details. He told me enough. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He said James came to him afterward, not right away, but 2 weeks later, and told him he had made a mistake. Rebecca looked at her. James told Oliver he had been wrong about something significant, which for James is the same as writing a formal apology in 3 languages and submitting it to Parliament. Eleanor's voice was warm with something that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but close to both. Oliver has known James for 25 years. He said he's seen it happen twice before. A pause. He said this was the first time it involved someone James loves. The word moved through the air between them and landed with a weight Rebecca had not been prepared for. She walked 3 steps before she answered. James and I... She stopped. Started again. What we have is complicated, Eleanor said not unkindly. Complicated and real and not finished becoming itself yet. She glanced sideways at Rebecca. Oliver says James watches you when you're in company, the way he doesn't watch the way James usually catalogs people rather than watching them. Rebecca thought of 4 days of equilibrium, of a sitting room visit at night, of a question about Baltic shipping routes that had cost something to ask. He's afraid, she said finally. He's been afraid since the beginning. He expressed it as condescension instead, because condescension felt like control, and control felt like safety. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. And you? What are you afraid of? The East Garden in November was spare and clear, the yew hedges stripped of their summer fullness. She had come to love it more in this season than in October, when everything had been dramatic and overwhelming. November honesty suited her better than October performance. That it won't change enough, she said quietly. That we'll reach a workable arrangement without understanding function without... She stopped. That I will spend the rest of my life being useful and not known. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Show him, she said finally. Not your knowledge, not your competence. He's seen those, and he's still keeping his distance from what they mean about you. She paused. Show him why it matters to you, what it comes from, what you're protecting when you protect the estate, or write the letters, or spend 3 days on supply contracts that weren't your assignment. Rebecca looked at the hedge. He needs... Eleanor continued to understand what he almost lost, not what the estate almost lost, what he almost lost. The men's voices drifted from somewhere inside the house, James's steady baritone, and Kingsley's quicker reply, and Rebecca listened to the sound of them familiar now in its rhythm, if not always its content. She had married into this house 3 months ago with a trunk and a letter, and a precision her father had given her like a birthright. She had expected to be underestimated. She had not expected to mind it so much. She had not expected somewhere underneath the minding to also want genuinely, with a specificity that surprised her to be here. To make it work. Not for survival. Not for position. Because Fairfield Manor, for all its ceremony, and its inherited certainties, and its 50-year-old supply contracts that no one had reviewed properly, had a kind of gravity she had felt the moment she came through the gates. And because James Fairfield, with all his certainty, and all his corrections, and all his expensive, exhausting pride, was underneath it all. Someone she had not stopped watching since the first night at that table, when he had said the thing that should have made her hate him. And she had noticed with that precise attention her father had trained in her since childhood, that his hands as he said it were perfectly carefully still. She walked back toward the house. She had work to do. The letter arrived from Copenhagen on a Thursday in late November, and it was addressed not to James, but to her. Henrik Brandt, the son of her father's old correspondent, the 27-year-old who ran the trading firm that moved documentation through Baltic frameworks no one else could navigate, had written in response to a letter she had sent 6 weeks earlier. A letter she had composed carefully over several evenings in the privacy of her sitting room. She had told James she was writing to an old contact of her father's. She had not told him why. She read Henrik's letter 3 times. Then she sat for a while and thought. Then she went to find James. He was in the library. She found him there more often lately, which she noted without remark, because the library was where she had been spending her mornings since she arrived, and she chose to believe the overlap was not accidental. Henrik Brandt, she said without preamble, because she had learned that preamble with James was mostly delay, will be in London in January. James looked up from his papers. He's agreed to meet with you about the Baltic routes. She paused. He's bringing the post-treaty documentation frameworks. All of them. He says. She unfolded Henrik's letter and found the line she wanted. He says, tell Lord Fairfield that the window for establishing Copenhagen intermediary relationships at favorable terms will close within 18 months. After that, the established players will have consolidated enough to make entry prohibitively expensive. James set down his papers. He looked at her, that new look, the one she still didn't have clean language, for the one that contained something she suspected she would be able to name, eventually given enough time and honesty. You've been working on this. Since when? Since the night you asked me if I knew the Copenhagen intermediaries. She folded Henrik's letter. I told you my father's contact's son runs the firm. You said I see, and went to bed. I wrote the letter the next morning. James was quiet for a long moment. You didn't tell me you were writing it. No. Why? She considered the question with the attention it deserved. Because I wasn't sure yet whether it would come to anything, she said. And because, she stopped. Then, because I wanted to do something for the estate that came entirely from me. Not as a response to a crisis. Not because I was reacting to something that had already gone wrong. Just, she paused. Because I could see the opportunity, and I wanted to reach for it. He looked at her for a long time. Henrik Brandt, he said finally. January. 3rd week if the schedule holds. He nodded slowly. And then quietly, almost under his breath. I should have asked sooner. She understood he did not mean about Henrik Brandt. She chose not to make him say it more clearly than that. Some things she had learned needed to arrive in their own time at their own pace without someone standing at the gate demanding they declare themselves before they'd finished the journey. She turned to go. Rebecca. She stopped. The supply contracts. He paused. Gibbs told me you'd renegotiated the coal terms. The new rate holds for 3 years with a penalty structure. Yes. He said the supplier's representative, when you presented the analysis, asked whether you'd trained as a solicitor. She felt the corner of her mouth move. What did Gibbs tell him? He said you had trained as a scholar's daughter. Another pause. He seemed to feel that answered the question. She walked out of the library and into the corridor beyond, and for the first time in 3 months inside Fairfield Manor, she felt not safe exactly, not settled exactly, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. Something that knew it had found the right ground, even if the ground was still shifting underfoot. Outside, November had turned the trees spare and clear and honest. She decided she liked November very much. Henrik Brandt arrived in London on the 15th of January, and James came home from the meeting with the particular expression of a man who has been confronted with irrefutable evidence that the world is larger and more interesting than he had previously allowed himself to believe. Rebecca was in the library when he returned. She heard the front door, heard the brief exchange between James and the footman, heard the footsteps in the corridor, and then the door opened, and James stood in it with his coat still on and said nothing for a moment. Just looked at her the way he had been doing with increasing frequency since November, like a man reassessing the distance between where he stood and where he wanted to be. "Well," she asked, "he's 27 years old." James came fully into the room and dropped into the chair across from her, which he had been doing more often lately, choosing the chair across from her rather than the chair at the desk, a small thing she had stopped pretending not to notice. "He looks younger. I spent the first 10 minutes trying to determine whether he was actually the man I was supposed to be meeting, or whether I had been sent to negotiate with his secretary. And then he opened the first folder of documentation and explained the post-treaty framework in approximately 45 seconds, in a way that made me feel I had been operating in a fog for the past 3 years. He paused. He also told me without apparent embarrassment that he had heard of me from you, that you had written to him describing the estate's position and commercial interests in terms that his words demonstrated a clearer understanding of Baltic trade dynamics than most established English brokers possess. Rebecca kept her expression neutral. "He's generous." He wasn't being generous. He was being accurate, and he knew it, and he wanted me to know he knew it. James looked at the fire. "He asked me how long we had been married." "What did you tell him?" 4 months. He paused. "He said your father had told him years ago that his daughter understood commerce better than most men he had trained, and that the man who married her would be either very clever or very lucky." The room was quiet. "He said," James continued, "that he suspected from the quality of your letter that the man who married you was going to turn out to be both." Rebecca set down her book. She picked it up again. Then she set it down a second time because she couldn't pretend to be doing anything other than listening. "We have an agreement in principle," James said. 3-year arrangement. Copenhagen intermediary for all Baltic documentation. He'll send a detailed framework by March." He stopped. He also suggested, and he made clear this was a suggestion, not a term that you might consider corresponding with his firm's documentation office directly. He said it would be more efficient. "More efficient than what?" "Than routing everything through me." James said it flatly without heat. His words, not mine. She waited. "I told him," James said, "that I thought that was an excellent suggestion." The quality of the silence that followed was something she had not experienced before in this house. Not the silence of tension held down, not the silence of something being navigated carefully. Something cleaner than that. "Good," she said finally. "Yes." He stood straightening his coat. "I believe it is." February came in hard and cold and brought with it Lady Eugenia Hartwell. Not as a dinner guest this time. As a house guest. 3 days, which James had apparently agreed to weeks earlier without telling Rebecca until 4 days before the arrival. An oversight, he acknowledged, with the slightly guilty directness of a man who knows he has made a mistake and would prefer to address it quickly rather than let it grow. She asked specifically. "In October." I told her yes because I didn't think. "You didn't think," Rebecca repeated. "About the implications." "You mean you didn't think about how she would treat your wife for 3 consecutive days under your roof?" A pause. "Yes, that." She looked at him. "All right." "Rebecca." I said, "All right, James. I can manage Lady Hartwell." What she did not say was, "I have been managing Lady Hartwell since the first night at that table when she decided to test the quality of my spine in front of 40 people. I know exactly what she's doing, and I know exactly how to answer it." What she did not say was that she had been managing women like Lady Hartwell her entire life, and that the management required a particular kind of patience she had long since developed, and a particular kind of precision she had been born with. What she did not say was that she was in a way she would have struggled to explain, almost looking forward to it. Lady Hartwell arrived on a Wednesday with 2 trunks, a personal maid, and the comprehensive social awareness of a woman who had been reading rooms for 60 years. She kissed Rebecca's cheek in greeting with the warmth of someone performing warmth, and her eyes in the moment of contact did the thing Rebecca had noticed before, that rapid comprehensive assessment that catalogued everything and gave away nothing. "Lady Fairfield." She stepped back. "You look well." "Thank you, Lady Hartwell. We're very pleased to have you." "Are you?" Not a question, an observation. "The East guest room has the best morning light in the house," Rebecca continued pleasantly. "I thought you might appreciate it." Something moved in Lady Hartwell's eyes. Brief, recalibrated. How thoughtful. The first evening went smoothly, in the way that things go smoothly when all parties are paying extremely close attention and none of them are willing to be the first to make an error. Lady Hartwell was at her best in intelligent, amusing, formidable, without requiring anyone to acknowledge how formidable she was, and Rebecca matched her beat for beat across a dinner table that felt by the end of it like a chess game that had gone 30 moves without a single piece being taken. The second morning was different. Rebecca was in the correspondence room when Lady Hartwell found her there. She came in without knocking, which was an entrance statement rather than an oversight, and she looked at the papers spread across the desk with an expression that contained both surprise and something that might very charitably have been called reassessment. "You work in here." Not an accusation. Not quite. Most mornings. Rebecca did not put down her pen. Lady Hartwell came closer. She looked at the documents without appearing to read them, or so it seemed until she said with perfect casualness, "That's a French commercial contract." "Yes." "Regarding the Baltic arrangements." Rebecca looked up. "You read French commercial contracts, Lady Hartwell. My husband was in trade for 30 years before he acquired the title." The older woman sat down uninvited, which was another entrance statement in a chair. "I read whatever crossed his desk that might affect our household. He pretended not to know I was doing it. It was an arrangement that suited us both." A pause. "Is that arrangement familiar to you?" Rebecca set down her pen. "It's becoming familiar." Lady Hartwell looked at her with that assessment in her eyes, and this time she did not trouble to conceal it. "I said something to you," she said, "at that dinner in October. I said James's servants spoke 3 languages. James said it. You laughed." "I laughed." Lady Hartwell agreed without flinching. "I was making an evaluation of whether you were—" She stopped. "Of whether you were the kind of woman who would still be sitting in this chair in 5 years. And a pause that contained 60 years of watching people. "I wasn't certain. I'm more certain now." It was Rebecca understood the closest to an apology she was going to receive, and it was also in its way more honest than most apologies she had been given. "Lady Hartwell." She folded her hands on the desk. "May I ask you something directly? I prefer it. The first night. The question about languages, the entire table's response to James's answer. Was that spontaneous, or had it been arranged?" The silence was 3 seconds long. "Arranged is a strong word," Lady Hartwell said. "Then a weaker word. Expected." The older woman looked at the window. James had married someone unexpected. People wanted to know what she was made of. The table was a test of a kind. And James participated in the test. James designed the test. Lady Hartwell turned back. He wanted to know what you would do, whether you would argue, whether you would break. Rebecca was very still. "He didn't know you yet," Lady Hartwell continued. "He had married someone he found compelling and didn't understand, and he was afraid of what he didn't understand, so he diminished it," Rebecca said quietly, "before it could diminish him." Lady Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. "You're not angry," the older woman said. It was not quite a question. "I'm past angry." Rebecca picked up her pen again. "I'm in the part that comes after angry." "And what part is that?" She looked at the Baltic contract on her desk. The part where I decide what to build. James found out what had been said in the correspondence room, because Lady Hartwell told him herself that evening before dinner. In the matter-of-fact way, she apparently did everything that needed doing. Rebecca was not present for this conversation. She heard about it from James that night, who came to her sitting room again. It had become, she realized, a pattern. These nighttime appearances, these conversations that happened in the quiet after the household was settled. "She told you," Rebecca said. "She told me it had been a test. She told me I designed it." He was standing near the window, which meant he was working something through. "She told me she thought you had passed it more thoroughly than I had." Rebecca said nothing. "Is that?" He stopped. "Did you know that it was deliberate?" "I suspected." "You suspected and you didn't. What would I have done with it, James?" She looked at him directly. "Come to you the morning after and said I believe last night was arranged to unsettle me. What would you have said?" He was quiet. "You would have told me I was being sensitive. You would have told me that social gatherings have a certain energy and I shouldn't read too much into it. You would have been patient and reasonable and entirely persuasive, and the conversation would have ended with me feeling that the original problem was actually my perception rather than what had happened." The words landed. She watched them land. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I probably would have." "I know." He turned from the window. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. You said that in October. I'm saying it again." He crossed the room and stood in front of her closer than he usually stood and looked at her with that expression, the one she had been trying to name since September. The one that was not control and not assessment, but something older and less manageable than both. "I designed that dinner to see what you would do. I told myself I was trying to understand you, but I was afraid of you, and I wanted to see if I could make you smaller." The honesty of it hit her harder than she expected. "James, no, let me finish." He sat down across from her in the chair the way he had been doing for months. "I wanted to see if I could make you smaller, and you sat there at that table, and you were not small. You were the most dignified person in that room, including me." He paused. "Especially me." She breathed slowly. "I don't know," she said finally, "how to respond to that." "You don't have to respond to it. I'm not telling you to make you say something kind. I'm telling you because—" He stopped. "Because I think you deserve to know the truth of what happened, and because I'm tired of being a man who manages his fear by making other people doubt themselves." The clock in the hall marked 9 o'clock. "Your father's book, Quieter Now. The 3rd volume. Ashmore sent me a note last week. He's citing it in a paper he's writing for the London Trade Society." She blinked. He's crediting your father by name. And in the letter to me, he mentioned that the woman who had brought the volume to his attention had demonstrated in his experience a commercial intelligence superior to most men he had encountered." He paused. "He asked whether you might be willing to correspond with him on the Baltic documentation question." She stared at him. "Lord Ashmore asked to correspond with me. Directly. By name." James looked at her with something that was as close to humble as she had ever seen him. "I wrote back and told him I would ask you." She wrote to Ashmore. She also wrote to Henrik Brandt about the framework documents and to her father's old colleague at Edinburgh, who had published something relevant on Scandinavian trade law, and to a woman named Margaret Ferris in London, whom she had met once at a lecture 3 years ago, and who turned out to know more about Northern European commercial practice than anyone else Rebecca had ever encountered. The correspondence room became hers, in a way that had nothing to do with permission and everything to do with use. Mrs. Holt began bringing the household accounts to Rebecca first, still with perfect deference, still technically following the established order of things. But the information now arrived at Rebecca's desk before it arrived anywhere else, and they both understood this without discussing it. The servants noticed. Servants always noticed. And then, in the first week of March, the thing that had been building since October arrived the way the most significant things always arrive, not dramatically, not telegraphed by any warning, but quietly through a door that appeared to be about something else entirely. The letter came from a man named Aldous Pemberton. Not Lord Pemberton, she thought of the investor who had praised her Marchetti letters, but a different Pemberton. Aldous, a solicitor based in Lincoln's Inn, who wrote in the careful language of a man who has been paid to deliver unpleasant information and has learned through experience that the manner of delivery matters almost as much as the content. The letter was addressed to James. Rebecca was not in the room when he read it. She was in the library when he found her, and she knew from the way he walked, not the window walk of internal processing, but something quicker and harder, that whatever was in the letter was not a small problem. He handed it to her without speaking. She read it. Then she read it again. Aldous Pemberton of Lincoln's Inn wrote on behalf of a consortium of investors, 7 men names she recognized as significant, who had apparently been working quietly for the past 14 months to acquire a controlling interest in the primary trading route that connected Fairfield's Baltic arrangements to its English markets. They had done it through 3 intermediary firms, each purchase appearing unrelated, the pattern only visible when all 3 were laid beside each other. They had been building toward this for over a year, and they had succeeded, which meant that the Marchetti letters had protected. Everything the Baltic arrangement with Henrik Brandt had been designed to secure now sat at the edge of a mechanism that made the Marchetti-Salvatore scheme look straightforward by comparison. Pemberton's letter was offering a negotiation. That was the polite word for it. The actual word, the word that lived underneath the careful legal language, was surrender. How long have they been doing this? James's voice was very controlled. She recognized the control. She had learned it the way you learn to read weather, as a sign of how serious the thing underneath it was. At least 14 months. The first purchase was... She went back through the letter. January of last year, before we married. Yes. So this? He stopped. She had already seen it. She had seen it on the second reading. The thing that made the letter more than a business threat. The thing that turned it from a problem into something that required a different kind of response. The consortium, she said carefully. The 7 investors. Do you know them? 4 of them. Look at the 5th name. He looked. She watched his face. Hargrove, he said flatly. Yes, Charles Hargrove. She had not met him, but she had heard the name in passing 3 times since arriving at Fairfield Manor, always in a context that suggested history, and tension always dropped with the careful brevity of something people have agreed not to discuss at length. Who is he to you? She asked. James set the letter down. He stood with his hands flat on the desk, the way he stood when he needed something solid under him. His father and my father were in business together, he said, for 11 years. They built 3 commercial arrangements jointly, the kind of arrangements that looked like partnership and functioned as debt. He paused. When my father died, the terms of the arrangements favored Hargrove Sr. significantly. He took the favorable terms and declined to negotiate. The legal right was entirely his. Another pause. The human decency of it was... He stopped. Less clear, Rebecca said. My mother spent the first 2 years after my father's death managing what was left. I was 17. He looked at the window. Not the processing look. Something older than that. I've never spoken about this, not even to Kingsley. I know. She had figured that out from the way the name was handled, the brevity and the careful silence that surrounded it in this house. Charles Hargrove, James continued, is his father's son. I have spent 12 years rebuilding what his father took and building enough beside it that it wouldn't matter anymore. He turned back. I thought it didn't matter anymore. She picked up the letter again. He's been planning this since before we married. 14 months means he started moving in November of the year before. He knew about the Baltic arrangements before we did. How? Someone told him. She looked at the names again. Or he's been watching the estate's commercial movements long enough to anticipate the strategy. She paused. This isn't opportunistic, James. It's targeted. The room was very quiet. What do we do? James asked. It was the 3rd time he had asked her that question, phrased exactly that way, the we without apparent effort. She noticed every time. The consortium controls the route, she said, slowly working through it. But controlling the route only gives them leverage if we have no alternative. She looked at the letter. The Salvatore model, the mechanism I found in the original Marchetti documents. It only worked because there was a single point of failure. This is the same structure. One choke point. Can we go around it? Possibly. She was quiet for a moment. Henrik Brandt. James looked at her. His Copenhagen firm, the documentation routing he uses doesn't go through the same London channels. He moves through different intermediaries. She picked up her pen. If we restructure the Baltic arrangement to route through Copenhagen rather than through London entirely, it would take months to establish. 6 weeks if Henrik moves quickly. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. I can write to him today. And... She stopped. What? Margaret Ferris. She looked up. The woman I've been corresponding with about Northern European trade law. She's been working with a consortium of her own smaller, not as established but solid, who have been trying to break into the Baltic routes for 2 years. They've been blocked by the same London intermediaries that Hargrove's people now control. She paused. Which means they have motivation. James stared at her. You're talking about building a counterweight. I'm talking about turning a problem into an alignment. She set down her pen. Hargrove's people think they've isolated us. They think controlling the route means controlling us. But the route is only valuable because of what it connects. If what it connects moves, the route becomes worthless. James's voice had changed. She had heard it change before in the correspondence room in the library, but not quite like this. Not with this quality of a man watching something assemble itself in front of him that he had not known was possible. They've spent 14 months acquiring a position that we can make irrelevant, if we move first, and move quickly. She was already drafting the letter to Henrik in her head. And if Hargrove doesn't realize what we're doing until we've moved. James looked at her for a long moment. He'll know. When we start the rerouting, he'll know what we're doing. Yes. But he won't be able to stop it quickly enough if we have Henrik and Margaret Ferris and Ashmore has been looking for a reason to act on the Baltic question for months, all moving simultaneously. A pause. That's 3 separate relationships you've built since October, James said quietly. She held his gaze. I've been busy. Something moved through his expression. She had learned to read him in the 5 months since that dinner, learned the specific language of his silences and his stillnesses, learned which expressions were control and which were something that control was covering. This was neither. This was something she hadn't seen before. Rebecca. He came around the desk. He stood close to her, closer than he had stood since the East Garden in October, closer than the careful distance he had maintained through months of slow renegotiation. I need to tell you something. She waited. When I read Pemberton's letter, he said, the first thing I thought, the very first thing before strategy, before anger, before anything practical was, I need Rebecca. The sitting room was very still. Not because you would know what to do, he continued. Though you do. Not because of the Baltic contacts or Henrik or Margaret Ferris or any of it. He stopped. Because I did not want to face this without you. Not as a strategist. As... He stopped again. She did not help him find the word. Not this time. He found it himself. As my partner. As the person I... Another stop. As the person I have been understanding for 5 months that I love, and have been too frightened and too proud to say. The clock in the corridor. A gust of wind beyond the window. The absolute silence of a house holding its breath around a moment. She looked at him. James Fairfield Duke, heir to 3 generations of certainty, standing in front of her, with his hands open at his sides and nothing to defend himself with. You are the most expensive admission I have ever heard a man make. Something broke in his expression. Not broke, released. Yes. And you chose to make it in the middle of a crisis. You were already thinking about Henrik Brandt and Margaret Ferris. His voice was rough at the edges. I thought if I didn't say it now, I might not... James. He stopped. She stepped toward him. 1 step. Deliberate. Write to Ashmore, she said. I'll write to Henrik and Margaret tonight. In the morning. She paused. In the morning, we'll talk about Charles Hargrove and what we're going to do about him properly. Together. He searched her face. And the rest of it? He asked quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had spent 5 months learning to see her, and had chosen in the center of the worst threat his estate had faced to say the hardest true thing he knew. "The rest of it," she said, "is not going anywhere." She turned to the desk and picked up her pen, and James Fairfield went to write to Ashmore. And outside Fairfield Manor, the March wind was picking up, carrying the specific quality of air that comes just before something changes. And inside the correspondence room, a woman was writing 3 letters simultaneously that would in the coming weeks either save everything or lose it. And she was not afraid. She was for the first time since the night at that dining table entirely herself. And that she had learned was the only foundation worth building from. The 3 letters went out that same night. Rebecca wrote until past midnight, the candles burning low in the correspondence room, while the rest of Fairfield Manor slept. She wrote to Henrik Brandt first, concise, specific, the language of someone who understood exactly what she needed and had no time to be indirect about it. She explained the Hargrove situation in 3 paragraphs, outlined the rerouting proposal in 2 more, and closed with a single question. How quickly could his Copenhagen firm establish the alternative channels? She wrote to Margaret Ferris next. And this letter was longer because Margaret required context and because the opportunity Rebecca was presenting her was significant enough that she deserved to understand its full shape before she committed to it. She wrote carefully, choosing each word the way her father had taught her. Precision is respect. Rebecca. Imprecise language is how you tell someone their time doesn't matter. And by the time she sealed the second envelope, her right hand was beginning to ache. The 3rd letter was to Ashmore, and James had already written his own version, so hers was shorter. A supplementary note explaining the technical dimensions of the rerouting plan, the specific documentation frameworks that would need to shift the legal considerations that Ashmore, with his London connections, was best positioned to manage quickly. She brought all 3 to Gibbs at midnight and told him they needed to leave with the first post in the morning. Gibbs looked at the 3 envelopes. He looked at her. He said with the composure of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything that happened in this house. "Yes, my lady." She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Not because of Hargrove, though. Hargrove was real, and the threat was real, and she had a clear-eyed understanding of how badly this could go if they misjudged the timing. Not because of the letters, or the Baltic rerouting, or the complicated geometry of moving 3 separate relationships into alignment quickly enough to matter. Because James had said "I love you" in the middle of a crisis, in the way that only people who mean it say it, not as a performance, not as a strategy, but as something that had simply become too large to keep holding in. She lay in the dark and thought about the man she had married 8 months ago. The man who had stood at that dining table and made her feel like a specimen. She thought about October and November and the long, slow winter of watching him learn to see her. She thought about the East Garden and the sitting room visits and the word partner and the way his hands had been open at his sides undefended when he said it. She thought, "I did not expect this. And underneath that, I wanted this. And underneath even that, quieter and more honest than either, I am frightened of how much I wanted this." Henrik's reply came in 6 days. 6 days, which was faster than she had calculated and faster than James had believed possible. And when Gibbs brought the letter to the correspondence room, Rebecca read it standing up because she had not yet sat down since receiving it. Henrik could move. More than that, he had been anticipating something like this. The London intermediary channels had been creating friction for his Copenhagen firm for 18 months, and he had been looking for an English partner with sufficient standing and motivation to justify the capital investment of establishing a parallel structure. He had assumed he wrote with what she recognized as his version of diplomacy, that it would take longer to find one. He had detailed figures. He had timelines. He had a proposed framework for the alternative documentation routing. That was, she realized as she read it through, better than what she had outlined in her letter to him. Not better, more sophisticated, built on foundations he had clearly been preparing for longer than she had known him. She read the last paragraph twice. "I should tell you, Lady Fairfield, that when your father and I corresponded about Baltic trade in his final years, he described for me once a daughter who read contracts the way other people read poetry, for what they were hiding rather than what they said. He told me that whoever married her would spend the rest of his life discovering how large the world was. I hope Lord Fairfield is finding this to be the case." She folded the letter. She pressed it flat against the desk for a moment with both hands. Then she went to find James. "I was in the library with Kingsley, who had arrived the previous morning and had been given a condensed version of the Hargrove situation, in the way Kingsley apparently preferred his serious information matter-of-fact, complete without softening. He had listened with his particular quality of attention, and then said precisely, 'Well, that's a problem,' and immediately began being useful. She came in and handed James Henrich's letter without preamble. He read. Kingsley read over his shoulder without being invited, which was so characteristic that nobody acknowledged it. 6 weeks, James said, looking up, "if we move on the English side simultaneously." She sat down. "Margaret Ferris wrote yesterday. She's in. Her consortium has been looking for exactly this kind of opening for 2 years. She says." She pulled the second letter from her pocket. "She says, and I'm quoting directly, that she would rather build something new than spend another year petitioning the people who benefit from keeping her out." Kingsley made a sound that was almost admiration. "Who is this woman?" "Someone who knows what it is to be told the door is closed." Rebecca looked at the letter. "She's very good. Hargrove will see the movement," James said. He was thinking out loud now, which was a thing she had learned to recognize, and not interrupt the specific quality of his voice when he was working something through and needed sound to do it. "When Henrich starts establishing the Copenhagen routing, when Ferris's consortium starts moving, Hargrove's people will know something is happening." "Yes." "Can we move fast enough that it doesn't matter?" "That depends," she said, "on how quickly Ashmore can act on the London side." As if in response to his name. Ashmore arrived at Fairfield Manor the following day. He came unannounced, which was not characteristic of him, arriving mid-morning with the particular energy of a man who has read something that has changed his understanding of a situation, and cannot wait the standard interval before acting on it. He came directly to the library. He shook James's hand, nodded to Kingsley, and then turned to Rebecca with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the pleasant condescension of that first dinner. Not the careful recalibration of the evening he had asked for her father's book. Something more direct than either. "The consortium," he said without greeting. "Hargrove's group. I know 2 of the 7 investors." Rebecca felt the air in the room change. "Know them well?" James asked. "Well enough." Ashmore sat down. He looked at Rebecca. "One of them, Clement Reyes, has been uncomfortable with the arrangement for at least 3 months. I had dinner with him in December, and he said something that I didn't understand at the time. He said he had gotten into a business relationship that had moved further than he'd agreed to." Ashmore paused. "I understand now what he meant." "He didn't know what Hargrove was building," Rebecca said. "He knew he was buying into a route acquisition. He didn't know it was targeting Fairfield specifically. He didn't know about the family history." Ashmore looked at her steadily. "He's not a man who enjoys being used for someone else's grudge." The room was very quiet. "Can you reach him?" James asked. "I had breakfast with him last Tuesday." Ashmore's voice was entirely dry. "I came here directly afterward." James looked at Rebecca. She looked at Ashmore. "If Reyes withdraws, the consortium loses 1 of 7 votes. That's not enough to collapse the position." "No," Ashmore agreed. "But Reyes knows the other 6. And there are 2 more whose commitment in his assessment is contingent rather than firm." He paused. "If the right information reached those 2 about what Hargrove actually intends, the personal dimension of it, the fact that they've been recruited into a private war, it might be enough to destabilize the consortium from within." "While we're building the alternative routing from without," Rebecca said slowly, "hit it from both sides." Kingsley, who had been quiet, looked almost satisfied. "Hargrove's counting on having time. He thinks you don't know what he's done or how he's done it. If you remove that time advantage, he'll have a position that's worth considerably less than he paid for it," Rebecca finished, "at exactly the moment when 3 of his 7 investors are reconsidering their commitment." Ashmore nodded. "The question," James said very carefully, "is what we tell those investors. We can't simply claim Hargrove is acting out of personal motivation without evidence. Rebecca thought of the letter from her father. The one about 1789, about the Dutch shipping matter, about the 6 weeks of work, and the brief polite note, and the debt that had never been acknowledged. She thought of the secondary documentation in the case file, the name that appeared as consultant, the hours billed at a fraction of their value. "There's a paper trail," she said quietly. "It goes back further than 14 months. Everyone in the room looked at her. "My father's correspondence, his case files from the 1789 Fairfield dispute." She paused. "He documented everything. He always documented everything. He used it as teaching material, how commercial disputes develop, how they resolve, what patterns repeat." She looked at James. "He documented the terms of the settlement. He documented the Hargrove senior position. And he documented—" She stopped. "What?" James's voice was careful. "He documented a letter he received in 1803. She remembered the papers in Edinburgh, her father's organized files, the letter she had read 4 years ago without fully understanding its significance. From Charles Hargrove, the son. Written when Hargrove was 22. He wrote to my father, apparently knowing my father had been present for the 1789 matter, asking for details about the settlement terms." She paused. "He was building a picture, even then." The room absorbed this. "He's been planning this," James said slowly, "for 16 years. Or laying the groundwork, waiting for an opportunity that made it worth acting." She kept her voice steady, though what she felt underneath it was not entirely steady. "The Fairfield estate's expansion into Baltic trade was probably what triggered it. He saw you building something significant, and he decided the moment had come." James was absolutely still. She knew that stillness now knew what it cost him, knew what it was containing. "He used your father," James said, and his voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. "He wrote to a scholar to extract information. He used an old man's meticulous records against—" "My father would have told him the truth freely," Rebecca said. "He always told the truth freely. He didn't believe in withholding information from people who asked for it." She paused. "He would have thought Hargrove was simply curious about legal history." The silence that followed had a specific texture. "Your father," Kingsley said quietly, "sounds like a remarkable man. How was?" She kept her voice even. "He also kept copies of every letter he ever sent or received. He catalogued them by date and subject. His files are in Edinburgh in the care of his colleague at the university." She looked at James. "If those files contain Hargrove's 1803 letter, and if that letter demonstrates that Hargrove Sr.'s son was deliberately mapping the Fairfield settlement terms as early as 16 years ago, then Reyes and the uncertain investors," Ashmore said, "are not simply being told about personal motivation. They're being shown documentation of it." James stood up. He crossed to the window, not the processing walk, something more decisive than that. "How quickly can you get those files?" he asked without turning around. "I can write to Professor Alderton at Edinburgh today." She was already calculating. "He'll have access to my father's archive. If he moves quickly, a week, 10 days, for the most relevant correspondence to reach us." "That's inside Henrik's 6-week window," Kingsley said. "If Alderton moves quickly." She paused. "He will. He was my father's closest colleague for 30 years. He'll understand why it matters." James turned back from the window. He looked at Ashmore. "Reach Reyes. Not yet, not until we have the documentation. But keep the conversation warm." Ashmore nodded once. "Kingsley." James stopped. "I'll stay," Kingsley said simply. "As long as you need." James looked at Rebecca last, and in the look was something she had been accumulating evidence for since October, something she no longer needed evidence to confirm. "Write to Edinburgh," he said. She was already reaching for her pen. The files arrived in 9 days. Professor Alderton. 73. Methodical, deeply loyal to her father's memory, had apparently understood the urgency from the first line of her letter, and had spent 2 days personally sorting through the relevant correspondence before dispatching the most critical documents with a private courier he trusted. They came in a leather satchel sealed with red wax, and when Rebecca opened it at the correspondence room desk, James standing beside her, she found 46 pages of her father's careful handwriting, and nested among them the 1803 letter from Charles Hargrove. It was better than she had hoped, and worse than she had feared. Hargrove at 22 had written with the specific confidence of a man who believed he was being clever, who had not yet learned the difference between intelligence and wisdom. He had asked her father for details about the Fairfield settlement, using language that was simultaneously flattering and extractive, complimenting the scholar's expertise, while systematically pulling every piece of information that could map the financial structure of the 1789 agreement. But the letter also contained something neither Rebecca nor James had anticipated. In the fourth paragraph, Hargrove had written, "My father has always maintained that the Fairfield family's recovery from the '89 settlement was more rapid than the terms should have allowed. I wonder if you might shed light on whether there were other arrangements, informal ones, that supplemented the documented terms." Rebecca read that paragraph twice. She looked at James. "He thought my father helped your family beyond what the formal settlement recorded." She kept her voice level. "He's been looking for evidence of an informal arrangement that he believes existed and that he believes his father was owed a share of." James stared at the letter. "There was no informal arrangement." "I know that. You know that. But Hargrove believes there was, and he's been building this position for 16 years, trying to recover something that never existed." The irony of it was so complete she couldn't entirely contain it, that the man trying to bring down the Fairfield estate was doing so in pursuit of a phantom. A grievance built on a misreading that the entire elaborate architecture of his revenge was constructed on a foundation that wasn't there. "He's wrong," James said flatly. "Yes. About everything. About the arrangement, and about what his father was owed." She paused. "Your grandfather dealt fairly with Hargrove Sr. The terms were hard, but they were legitimate. The money Hargrove took was what the agreement entitled him to. Nothing more was owed." James sat down heavily. For a long moment he said nothing. "I've spent 12 years," he said, "rebuilding what I thought Hargrove Sr. had taken unfairly. Building defenses against a man who was doing the same thing to me because he thought my family had taken from his." He looked at the ceiling. "We've both been wrong about each other for 16 years. "You haven't done anything to him," she said carefully. "Building the estate back isn't aggression. No. But I've been carrying it, the anger about it, using it as—" He stopped. "Using it as a reason to be harder than I needed to be about certain things. Tighter. Less willing to trust." He paused. "Some of how I was with you in the beginning, some of that was Hargrove. Not knowing I was doing it, but, James." She waited until he looked at her. "That's a different conversation. An important one, but different." She put her hand on the letter. "Right now, we have a man who is about to do real damage to this estate because of a grievance that was never valid. And we have the evidence to stop him." He looked at the letter. "Ashmore." "Today." She agreed. Ashmore moved quickly once he had the documentation. He met with Clement Reyes on a Tuesday with the 1803 letter and two of her father's supporting documents as exhibits, and the conversation reportedly lasted 2 hours. By Thursday, Reyes had spoken to the two uncertain investors. By Friday, James received a formal communication from the consortium's solicitors, indicating that 3 members had withdrawn their commitment and were seeking terms for divesting their acquired position. 3 of 7. Not a collapse. Not yet. But a fracture. And into a fracture, with the right application of pressure, you could fit quite a lot. Henrik Brandt's alternative routing had been in preparation for 3 weeks by then, moving quietly through Copenhagen channels that Hargrove's people had no established view into. Margaret Ferris's consortium had begun positioning simultaneously, and their movements were invisible to anyone watching the London trading networks because they weren't moving through London at all. The first sign that Hargrove understood what was happening came on a Wednesday afternoon in the form of a personal letter, not through solicitors, not through intermediaries, but directly addressed to James in handwriting, that conveyed something between controlled fury and the specific desperation of a man watching a plan unravel faster than he can respond to it. James read it in the library alone, and then brought it to Rebecca. She read it standing, Hargrove wrote that he was prepared to negotiate, that the consortium's position was strong, but that he recognized there was value in a different arrangement, that he believed they could reach an agreement that served both parties. He used the word reasonable 4 times. At the very end he wrote, "I am aware that Lady Fairfield has been active in the commercial arrangements of your estate. I would ask that any negotiation be conducted directly between us as principals, without—" She stopped reading. She looked up. James was watching her. "He wants to negotiate with you," she said, "and exclude me." "Yes. He thinks that if he can get you alone." She paused. "He thinks the strategy came from you. He doesn't know I exist in this context. He knows you're my wife. He knows you're married. He does not know—" She stopped. Something was occurring to her. "James, has Ashmore told him anything about who identified the consortium's structure, who did the analysis?" A pause. "No," James said slowly. "Ashmore let him assume it was legal counsel." "Then Hargrove doesn't know." She set the letter down. "He's been negotiating blind. He doesn't know the 1803 letter came from my father's files. He doesn't know about Henrik. He doesn't know about Ferris." She looked at James. "He thinks he's dealing with you and your solicitors. He has no idea that everything that's been done to counter him came from—" She stopped herself. James looked at her with an expression she had no trouble reading at all. "From the scholar's daughter," he said quietly. The room held that for a moment. "Respond to his letter. Tell him you're willing to meet. 1 week from now in London. Neutral ground. Kingsley can arrange the location. And when he arrives, he'll find out exactly who he's been negotiating with." James looked at the letter, then at her. "You want to be in that room. I want to be in that room." She held his gaze. "Not to surprise him, not to humiliate him. To be there as what I am, what I have been this entire time." She paused. "He spent 16 years building a case against your family based on a misreading. He spent 14 months building a commercial trap based on a strategy he thought was invisible. He's done all of it without ever once accounting for the possibility that the woman your servant's laughter dismissed at a dinner table was the thing standing between him and everything he wanted." James was quiet for a long moment. "He won't be prepared for you." "No," she agreed. "He won't." "Is that fair?" She thought about the 1803 letter. She thought about the careful, deliberate erosion of supply contracts. She thought about October and the design dinner and 42 people laughing at something that was supposed to make her feel small. "Probably not," she said. "But it's true, and I have spent enough of this year navigating around men who were not prepared for me." She picked up her pen. "I am done going around." James looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Write the response, I'll sign it." She wrote. He signed. And somewhere in London, Charles Hargrove was waiting to sit across a table from a man he thought he understood, not knowing, not yet, that the room he was walking into had been prepared by the one person in England whose understanding of his 16-year plan was more complete than his own. The night before the London meeting, James came to her sitting room for the last time as a man who had not yet said everything he needed to say. He knocked. She opened the door. He came in and looked at her, and something in his face had the quality of a man who has finally stopped carrying something heavy enough that the relief of setting it down had not yet been replaced by knowing what to do with his empty hands. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Before tomorrow." She waited. "My father used to say that the most important thing a man could protect was his name." He paused. He meant reputation, standing, the opinion of the right people in the right rooms. He looked at her. "I've been living by that principle for 12 years without questioning it. Building the estate back, rebuilding the name, making certain that the Hargroves of the world could never look at us as diminished again." He stopped. "It never occurred to me that what I was protecting had nothing to do with what actually mattered." "What actually matters?" she asked quietly. "Who you are when the room is empty. What you build that has nothing to do with names or positions or what other people can see." He paused. What you choose to do with what you know when you could use it to make yourself large at someone else's expense, and you choose not to. She looked at him. You have never once used what you know against me, he said. Every piece of information you had the 1789 matter, your father's consulting work, every correction you could have made in front of every person who was laughing. You could have deployed all of it to humiliate me. You had more than enough. I know. Why didn't you? She thought about it honestly the way the question deserved. Because humiliating you would have meant I cared more about being right than about being here, she said finally. And I cared about being here. She paused. I cared about you, even when you were making it very difficult. He crossed the room in 3 steps. He took her hands, both of them deliberately, the way a man holds something he has learned the value of by almost losing it. I have been wrong about a great many things this year. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time being right about you. She looked at their joined hands, at this man who had walked into his own house in October, believing he understood the world completely, and who was standing now in the evidence of how much that certainty had cost them both, holding her hands and not flinching from the cost. That, she said, seems like a reasonable place to start. Outside the window. London waited. Hargrove waited. The meeting waited, and everything that would come from it, the reckoning, the resolution, whatever was built on the other side of it. All of it was waiting in the direction of tomorrow. But tonight, James Fairfield held his wife's hands in a sitting room of the house they were building together, and the silence between them was not the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of people who have finally arrived at the same place at the same time and know it and do not need to fill it with anything more. The carriage to London left Fairfield Manor at 6 in the morning. Rebecca was already awake when the household began moving around her, had been awake for an hour before that, sitting at her writing desk in the thin early light with her father's letter open in front of her. Not the 1803 Hargrove letter, the other one. The one her father had written to her in October, the one about 1789, and the Dutch shipping matter, and the brief polite note that had arrived afterward, and the debt that had never been acknowledged in any lasting way. She had read it so many times by now that she could have recited it from memory. She read it again anyway. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in the leather satchel, alongside the copies of the key documents from Professor Alderton's package, and went downstairs to meet her husband. James was in the entrance hall, already dressed, speaking quietly with Kingsley, who had agreed to come to London as a witness, not a legal witness, simply a presence. The kind that matters in a room when the stakes are high enough that having someone trustworthy at your back changes the quality of what you can say. He looked up when she came down the stairs. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the night before, the way that said something had settled in him finally after months of it working loose from whatever it had been nailed to. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it completely. The meeting was set for 11 o'clock at a private room in a building off Fleet Street that Kingsley had arranged through a barrister friend. Neutral quiet, the kind of place where significant conversations happened without anyone outside needing to know they had happened at all. Ashmore was already there when they arrived. He had come separately, and with him was Clement Reyes, who turned out to be a compact, serious man of 50, with the expression of someone who has recently discovered he has been used in a way he finds personally offensive and has not yet finished being angry about it. Reyes shook James's hand. He shook Kingsley's hand. Then he turned to Rebecca, and something in his face shifted with recognition, though they had never met. "You wrote to Margaret Ferris," he said without preamble. "Yes. She told me." He looked at her steadily. "She said the woman who brought her consortium into this arrangement understood the structure of Hargrove's position better than Hargrove's own solicitors did." A pause. "She also said the letters were the clearest commercial analysis she had read from anyone who wasn't charging £500 a year for the privilege." Rebecca held his gaze. "My father believed clarity was a courtesy." Reyes looked at her for another moment. Then, something in his expression that had been reserved moved quietly toward something else. "He sounds like a man worth knowing." He was. Yes. Hargrove arrived at 11 o'clock exactly. She had built a picture of him from the documents and the history, and James's careful, controlled silence whenever his name came up, and the man who walked through the door matched some of that picture and departed from it in ways she found immediately interesting. He was 51, well-dressed in the manner of a man who understood that appearance was language, and he moved with the specific confidence of someone who had been the most powerful person in most of the rooms he had entered for the past 20 years. He stopped when he saw her. Not a dramatic stop. A brief recalibration, a fraction of a second, the kind a person makes when they encounter something their preparation has not accounted for. He looked at James. "I had assumed this would be a private meeting." "My wife is here in her professional capacity," James said, calmly, as though it were entirely ordinary, as though there were nothing unusual about stating it that simply, that completely in that tone. "She has been managing the strategic response to your consortium's activities. It seemed appropriate that she be present for its resolution." Hargrove's eyes moved back to Rebecca. She could see him reassessing, pulling up everything he knew or thought he knew, running it against the fact of her presence, finding the gap between the two, and not being certain what to do with it. "Lady Fairfield," he said finally, with the courtesy that English manners required regardless of everything else. "Mr. Hargrove." She gestured to the chair across the table. "Please." He sat. His solicitor, a young man who had come with him and who had the look of someone trying very hard to appear more composed than he was, sat beside him. Ashmore sat to her left. Reyes sat to James's right. Kingsley positioned himself near the wall with the practiced invisibility of a man who knew his role was to observe. She opened the leather satchel. She laid the documents out methodically, without rushing the way her father had taught her to present an argument. "Let the evidence speak first. Rebecca, your voice should only be what the evidence cannot say for itself." The 1803 letter came out last. She placed it on the table, centered facing Hargrove. She watched him read it. She watched the exact moment it happened in the third line of the fourth paragraph when he understood what he was looking at. His face did not collapse. He was too controlled for that, too many years of difficult rooms behind him. But something in his jaw changed. Something in the set of his shoulders. His solicitor leaned over and read. His face did the thing Hargrove's had not allowed itself, a rapid, undisguised movement of alarm. "This letter," Hargrove's solicitor began, "was obtained from my father's archive," Rebecca said. "Professor Alderton of Edinburgh University has the originals. These are authenticated copies. The chain of custody is documented." She paused. "Your client wrote to my father in 1803, seeking information about the 1789 Fairfield settlement. My father answered honestly, as he always did, because he had no reason to believe the inquiry was anything other than historical curiosity." She kept her voice even. "The letter demonstrates that the current consortium position was not a commercial opportunity identified in the past 14 months. It was the culmination of a strategy whose origins predate this decade, and whose motivation was personal rather than commercial." Hargrove looked at her, not at James. At her. "Who are you?" he asked. And it was not a social question. It was a genuine one. The question of a man confronting something his understanding of the world had not made room for. "Rebecca Fairfield," she said. "My father was Dr. William Caldwell. He spent 6 weeks working on the 1789 dispute between your grandfather's trading partners and the Fairfield estate. He charged 4 hours fees because he believed the family was in difficulty and didn't want the cost to add to it." She paused. "He kept everything, Mr. Hargrove. Every letter, every document, every case note. He cataloged them by subject and date. He used them as teaching material." Another pause. "He taught me from them." The room was very still. "The informal arrangement," Hargrove said. His voice had changed, not defeated but stripped of something. "You know what I believed?" "Yes, I read your letter carefully." She folded her hands on the table. "There was no informal arrangement. My father documented the settlement terms in full. What you have spent 16 years pursuing does not exist." A silence that had considerable weight settled over the table. Hargrove sat with it. He was, she realized, not a stupid man, had never been a stupid man, and the not stupidity of him was at this moment working through the full implications of what she had said with a thoroughness that was almost painful to watch. "My father believed," he said finally, that he was owed more than the settlement provided. Your father was wrong, James said quietly. My grandfather dealt with him fairly. The terms were hard, but they were legitimate. Nothing additional was owed. He paused. I know this because I spent 3 years after my father died going through every document in the estate's possession, trying to understand what had happened in 1789. I know the settlement as well as I know anything. He looked at Hargrove directly. Your father built a grievance on a misreading, and you have spent 16 years inheriting that grievance without questioning whether it was real. Another silence. Hargrove's solicitor leaned close and murmured something. Hargrove did not respond to it. I was looking at the 1803 letter. The consortium, he said at last. 3 members have withdrawn. Yes, Ashmore said from her left. And their positions are being acquired. A pause. By parties whose interests align with Fairfield. Hargrove's eyes moved to Reyes. Reyes met his gaze without apology. I agreed to a commercial acquisition, Reyes said flatly. Not a vendetta. Those are different things, and I don't participate in the second. Something moved through Hargrove's face. Then he looked back at Rebecca. The alternative routing. Copenhagen. She did not confirm it. She didn't need to. You've been building it for weeks, Hargrove continued. While the consortium believed you were contained. He stopped. How long have you known about our position? Since the Pemberton letter arrived, in March. And in that time He stopped himself. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at James, then back at her. The Marchetti matter last autumn, the investors who withdrew. Yes. That was also. Yes. A long pause. I was told, he said slowly, that the Fairfield estate had become commercially sophisticated in the past year, that it was moving with a precision that was new. He looked at her with something that was not quite what she had expected, not anger, not humiliation, but something that sat closer to recognition. I attributed it to new legal counsel. No, he agreed quietly. His solicitor started to speak. Hargrove stopped him with one hand, for perhaps 30 seconds. Nobody in the room said anything. Then Hargrove straightened in his chair and looked at James with the expression of a man who has run a very long race and arrived at the finish line to discover he has been on the wrong course the entire time. What are your terms? He asked. The terms took 2 hours to negotiate, and Rebecca led the negotiation. Not exclusively, James was present, active, and precise in the way he was always precise when he was fully engaged with something that mattered. But she led it, and nobody in the room by the second hour was operating under any confusion about that fact. The consortium's acquired position in the trading route would be sold. The price was fair, she had insisted on fair, over Ashmore's raised eyebrow and Kingsley's impressed silence, because unfair terms created resentment, and resentment created future problems, and she was done building on foundations that had cracks in them. The alternative routing through Copenhagen would proceed regardless, but the London Channel would remain operational under restructured terms that removed the choke point Hargrove's people had created. Margaret Ferris's consortium came in as a full partner on the Baltic arrangements. This was the piece that surprised Hargrove most visibly, that there was a second consortium, an entirely different network of relationships already positioned and moving. He had been watching Fairfield's front, and the counter had come from 3 directions simultaneously. He absorbed this without comment. But she could see him absorbing it. Near the end of the second hour, his solicitor pushed back on a specific penalty clause she had included for any future interference with the documented route. It was a strong clause, deliberately so, and the solicitor's objection was technically sound. Hargrove stopped him. "Leave it," Hargrove said. His solicitor stared at him. "Leave the clause." Hargrove did not look at his solicitor. He looked at Rebecca. "It's fair." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." His voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the length of the meeting. "I've been fighting the wrong war for 16 years. The least I can do is finish the right one honestly." He signed the agreement at 2:30 in the afternoon. James signed. Ashmore signed as witness. Reyes signed as the consortium's authorized representative. When the documents were complete and the solicitors were organizing their copies, Hargrove stood and buttoned his coat. He shook James's hand, brief, firm, the handshake of men who have resolved something that required resolution and have no particular desire to extend the ceremony of it. He shook Ashmore's hand. He nodded to Kingsley and to Reyes. He stopped in front of Rebecca. "Lady Fairfield." He paused. "Your father's name should have been remembered more honorably than it was." She looked at him steadily. He didn't need others to remember it honorably. He lived it that way. Something in Hargrove's face moved. Brief. Then he nodded once, put on his hat, and walked out of the room. His young solicitor followed, and in the doorway, the young man glanced back at Rebecca with an expression she had seen before, the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what was possible in a room. The recalibration that happened when something had moved that they hadn't known was movable. She did not acknowledge it. She began reorganizing the documents in the leather satchel. Kingsley said nothing until they were outside, which was characteristic of him. He saved the things that mattered for moments when there was space to say them properly. "Rebecca." He came to walk beside her. "I want you to know that I have been Oliver Kingsley for 41 years, and in that time I have sat in approximately 400 rooms where significant things were decided." He paused. "That was among the finest 2 hours of negotiation I have witnessed in all of them." She kept walking. "You're being generous." "I'm being precise." He sounded almost indignant. "I don't do generous. It's inefficient." She laughed, a genuine one, unexpected, the kind that comes before you've decided to allow it. Kingsley looked satisfied, in the way of someone who has aimed for something specific and hit it. James fell into step on her other side. I didn't say anything immediately. He walked with her for half a block in the thin March afternoon, and she could feel him deciding how to say what he was working up to, which was a thing she had learned to give him room for. "The penalty clause," he said finally. "The one you insisted on." "Yes." Ashmore thought it was too strong. Ashmore was wrong. "Yes." A pause. "He knows it now." Another pause. "Hargrove leaving it in, you expected that." "I hoped for it." "It's different from expecting it." "Why did you hope for it?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because leaving it in was the first honest thing he'd done in 16 years, she said slowly. He'd built everything on a story that wasn't true, and the moment he understood that the first instinct was to be honest. That matters. She paused. It doesn't undo the damage, but it matters. James was quiet for a moment. You're more forgiving than I am. I'm not forgiving him, I'm just noticing him accurately. She paused. He was wrong. He caused real harm. The clause stays in the agreement as a consequence. But he's also a man who spent 16 years in the wrong direction because his father handed him a map with an error in it, and he trusted it, the way sons trust what their fathers give them. She paused. I understand something about that. James absorbed this. Kingsley walking just slightly ahead, with the tact of a man who knows when not to listen while remaining present, had apparently become very interested in the buildings across the street. Your father, James said. He gave me precision, she said. He gave me an understanding of the world as a place where truth was findable if you looked carefully enough. He gave me the belief that being useful was worth more than being ornamental. She paused. He gave me all of that, and then he died, and I took everything he gave me into a marriage with a man who spent the first 4 months trying to make me smaller. She said it without heat. It was simply true. I could have been angry about the mismatch. I could have blamed my father for raising me wrong, for making me too much for the world I was walking into. But you didn't, James said. No, because he wasn't wrong about the world. He was just ahead of it, she paused. And I decided I would rather be ahead of it with him than comfortable inside it without him. They walked. The March air was sharp and clear. I want to tell you something, James said. You told me something last night. I want to tell you something else. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to look at her with that expression, the one she had been accumulating evidence for since October, and had no longer needed evidence to confirm since March. When we get back to Fairfield, I want to do something. She waited. I want to write to the London Trade Society, he said, formally, crediting your father's work, the full body of it, not just the third volume. The contribution to the 1789 case. The analytical framework that informed the Marchetti letters. All of it. He paused. And I want to credit you. By name. For the Marchetti matter and the Baltic arrangements and everything that has happened in this house in the past 8 months. She stared at him. James, I stood at a dinner table in October and told 40 people that knowledge alone doesn't make someone remarkable. I said it to diminish you, and everyone in that room understood I was doing it, and I knew they understood, and I did it anyway. His voice was steady, but it cost him something. She could hear the cost. I will not spend the rest of my life having that be the public record of how I treated you. She could not speak for a moment. The Trade Society letter, she managed finally, is a start. He held her gaze. A very small start, but I intend to be thorough. Kingsley had moved another discreet distance ahead and was now apparently fascinated by a lamppost. You realize, she said when she had found her voice, that crediting a woman by name for commercial strategy in a trade society publication will cause a considerable amount of conversation. Yes. Some of it very unflattering to you. Yes. You've considered this, Rebecca. His voice was quiet and completely certain. I spent 3 months correcting your French. The least I can do is spend the rest of my career correcting the public record. She looked at him. This man who had been so afraid of her that he had tried to make her small. This man who had come to her sitting room night after night to do the slow and costly work of learning to see clearly. This man who had stood in front of Hove, with his hands open and his voice steady, and said, "My wife is here in her professional capacity," as though it were the most natural sentence in the English language. All right. All right. All right, she said again, and she meant it with everything she had. They arrived back at Fairfield Manor as the last light was leaving the sky. The household had been waiting, not formally, not lined up, but in the way a household waits when something significant has been happening, and everyone in it knows it, and nobody has said so directly. Mrs. Holt met them in the entrance hall with a precision that managed to contain both relief and the dignified restraint of someone who had not been worrying at all. "Welcome home, my lord, my lady." Her eyes moved to Rebecca with a particular quality of attention. "I trust the day went well." "Very well, Mrs. Holt," Rebecca said. "Thank you." Something settled in the housekeeper's expression. "I'll have dinner ready within the hour." She moved away, and Rebecca heard her speaking to someone in the corridor beyond, heard the particular efficient cadence of the household, recalibrating itself back to its normal operating rhythm, and felt something she had not expected to feel so strongly. She felt home. Not the word, not the concept, but the thing itself. The specific gravity of a place that has learned the shape of you, that has made room for you in its daily life, that expects you to come through the door at the end of the day. She stood in the entrance hall and felt it, and did not try to make it smaller than it was. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the London Trade Society, acknowledging the submission James had made. They were in the correspondence room together, a habit now working in the same space. James with his papers, and Rebecca with hers. The comfortable, industrious quiet of two people who have found their rhythm in the same work when Gibbs brought it in with the Morning Post. James read it and handed it to her. The Society had accepted the submission for publication in their quarterly review. They had included a note from the editor expressing particular interest in the analytical methodology, described the framework developed from Dr. William Caldwell's third volume, and applied to the identification of the Marchetti-Salvatore mechanism. The editor's note ended with a question: would Lady Fairfield be willing to contribute a short piece on the application of linguistic precision to commercial documentation analysis? She read it twice. James was watching her. "Well," he asked. She set the letter down. "My father," she said quietly, "spent 30 years trying to get the Trade Society to take his methodology seriously." She paused. "They sent him a polite rejection letter in 1809. I know." James's voice was quiet. "I found the record of it in the estate's correspondence. We had received a copy because his methodology had been cited in relation to our affairs. He paused. It was one of the things I found when I went looking for the history of the 1789 matter. After October. She looked at him. You went looking. Yes. He held her gaze. I needed to understand what I had walked into. What you had walked into. He paused. What I had almost thrown away. The letter sat on the desk between them. Right back, James said. Accept. It will cause the conversation we discussed in London. Write back, he said again. Accept. And write the piece. Write it the way your father would have written it, thoroughly, precisely, without apology. He paused. With your name on it. She picked up her pen. Months passed in the way. Months pass when the work is real and the life around it is real. Not smoothly, not without difficulty, but with a forward momentum that had its own honesty. The Baltic routing through Henrik Brandt's Copenhagen firm was fully operational by summer. Margaret Ferris's consortium had established itself as a partner of standing, and Margaret herself had come to Fairfield for a week in June, a visit that had been, Rebecca thought, one of the most satisfying of her life. Two women sitting in the correspondence room working through commercial frameworks, while James and Kingsley dealt with a drainage problem that apparently required considerable discussion. The trade society piece had caused exactly the conversation she had predicted. Several members wrote letters of objection to the editor, two of them in language that was unambiguous about their opinion of women in commercial analysis. Several others wrote letters of support. Lord Pemberton, the original. Pemberton, the investor who had praised the Marchetti letters, wrote a public letter to the Society endorsing the methodology and suggesting, with the particular authority of 30 years of investment, that the Society might benefit from more such contributions. Ashmore cited her father's framework in his own Trade Society paper that autumn. He sent her a copy with a note that read in its entirety, "Credit where it is due, which is something I should have understood earlier." She kept the note. She kept all of it. Actually, the letters, the documents, Professor Alderton's package, her father's correspondence. She organized them in the correspondence room in the same careful system her father had used, catalogued by subject and date, because precision was respect, and respect was love, and love was in the end the only thing that lasted. At a gathering at Fairfield Manor in November, the first large formal dinner since that October night a year before, she found herself standing near the east window with Eleanor Kingsley while the room moved around them. "Lady Hartwell is watching you," Eleanor murmured with the amusement of a woman who finds human observation endlessly worthwhile. Rebecca glanced across the room. Lady Hartwell was indeed watching her with that comprehensive assessment she had applied since October of the previous year. When their eyes met, Hartwell raised her wine glass slightly, a gesture so small that nobody else would have seen it. Rebecca raised hers in return. "She respects you," Eleanor said. "She respected me in February. This is something else." "What is it?" She thought about it. "I think," she said finally, "it's something closer to satisfaction. She was testing in October whether I would last. She's watching now because I did, and because I turned out to be more than she was testing for, and that pleases her." A pause. "She likes being right about people, even when right means she underestimated them." Eleanor laughed, warm, genuine. "You understand people very precisely. My father said it was the same skill as reading contracts," Rebecca said. "Look for what they're protecting. Everything else is surface." From across the room, she felt James's awareness of her before she found his face, that specific quality of attention she had been learning since October, the way he tracked where she was without appearing to track anything. He was speaking to Lord Pemberton, and even from this distance, she could see that Pemberton was doing most of the talking, and James was listening with the focused attention he gave things that mattered to him. He caught her eye. He did not smile exactly. It was subtler than a smile, that adjustment in his expression that belonged to her, that she had watched develop over 12 months from nothing into something she recognized as surely as her own reflection. She turned back to Eleanor. "He told me once," she said quietly, "that he had been protecting the wrong things. And now," she looked around the room, the house that had tested her, the household that had learned her the network of relationships she had built from a traveling trunk, and a letter and a precision her father had given her like a birthright. She thought about the trade society piece with her name on it, about Henrik Brandt's letter in April saying the Copenhagen routing had exceeded projected efficiency by 30%. About Mrs. Holt bringing the household accounts to the correspondence room every Monday morning without being asked. About the question in her sitting room the night before the London meeting, "I need Rebecca," and what it had cost him to say it, and what it had meant to her to hear it. She thought about a dining table in October and 42 people laughing. She thought about her father, who had died knowing that the world would eventually catch up to what he had taught it. "Now," she said, "we're protecting the right things." That evening, after the guests had gone and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she went to the correspondence room. She opened the center drawer. She took out the letter she had carried since October. Her father's letter, the one about 1789, and the Fairfield family, and the 6 weeks of work and the debt that had never been acknowledged. She held it for a moment. Then she took out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote 2 lines. How was wrong that it would go unacknowledged forever. He was right about everything else. She folded the paper and placed it inside the letter and put them both back in the drawer. She picked up her pen and began the work that was waiting. Outside November had settled over Fairfield Manor with its honest, spare quality. The season that showed you things as they actually were, without the performance of bloom or the drama of storm, just the clear, true shape of what had lasted. Inside the correspondence room, Rebecca Fairfield, scholar's daughter, Duke's wife woman, who had walked into a room that tried to diminish her and had built something lasting in it, instead wrote with steady hands and a full heart, and the silence around her was not empty. It was the sound of a life fully claimed, completely hers.